Hello, I'm Ed,
And I'm Ben.
and this is What About Porridge? Welcome back to What About Porridge, the podcast where we try to make sense of health and nutrition without losing our minds in the process. I'm Ed, asking the obvious questions and perhaps a few less obvious ones. And as always, I'm joined by Ben, nutritional therapist, and the man who, like Sauron, has an eye which pierces all. Although for him, it's seeing instead to the utmost depths of the human digestive system. And today we're going to discuss a few different topics, actually. We've got some current affairs from the world of nutrition, and also we're going to go a bit deeper than we've managed to in previous episodes into paleo-style diets, I believe.
We are. It's the episode I've all been waiting for.
Nice. All right. Well, let's get into it and settle in. See if you can find yourself a vaguely nutrient-dense snack to keep you sustained during the conversation. You got a snack on the go, Ben?
Well, this is where I have to confess that I ate a whole bowl of crisps earlier on. Look,
What kind?
Here's the evidence.
I'm seeing an empty bowl.
Yeah, you're very much seeing an empty bowl. Olive oil crisps. I was worried they'd go off. In my defense.
Seems legit.
Right, we should just mention that nothing in this podcast is medical advice, just to get that out of the way.
Okay, very good.
And before we start, I've got a question for you, Ed.
Mm-hmm.
This time it's a not so fun question for Ed. And the question is, what is considered the leading risk factor for death globally, accounting for around 11 million premature deaths?
Ooh. Do you want my answer now?
You can have a go now, otherwise we'll answer at the end.
Risk factor.
Risk factor.
Obesity? I'm going to go for.
Okay, we'll come back and see how right you are at the end.
I mean, actually, no. Well, that can't be worse than smoking, right? Age?
Oh, I can't say anything without giving it away.
Oh, wait, no, you said premature death.
Mm.
Age is cheating, right?
Age is cheating, yeah. Right, well, we'll answer that at the end.
Yeah. It's Ed's special risk factor, which is a combination of obesity and smoking.
Okay, so let's get into it then.
All right, Ben. So give us a bit of an introduction. Who's this episode really aimed at? Because I know this is something you've been really passionate about.
Yeah, it's for anyone who wants to know why I go on about paleo and ancestral diets in general, and for anyone who wants to understand why so many of us are fat and sick. Basically, I'm going to talk about the evolutionary mismatch and why I think it plays a huge role in the epidemic of modern disease. And I'm going to argue that since we adopted our modern diet and lifestyle, we've become shorter, fatter, sicker, and less happy.
Okay. Yeah, not a fantastic list of outcomes. All right, that sounds really good. But before we get into paleo and ancestral diets, I think we wanted to do a bit of a kind of news bulletin, right, related to the new USDA food guidelines.
Yeah, that's right. So they were issued recently as the dietary guidelines for Americans. And we'll link to these from the website. But it's actually quite different from previous versions. Not only has it gone from 100 pages down to 10, but yeah, there are some substantial changes that are worth talking about. Firstly, it's worth mentioning that the US dietary guidelines are quite a big deal because they influence everything from school lunch programs to how military personnel are fed. So they have quite far-reaching consequences. And the evidence suggests that since they were introduced, people have actually followed them and their health has deteriorated significantly.
Is it worth talking at all about like the old version of the guidelines then? What aspects of them?
We'll compare and contrast as we go, especially talking about kind of some of the macronutrient recommendations. But the previous version was over 100 pages and quite difficult to read, and they've reduced it down to just 10 pages.
I think also probably worth saying, or correct me if I'm wrong, but the old version of the US guidelines are pretty similar to the current UK guidelines. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. There's not a huge difference. Exactly. So what's going to be interesting about this is to see what impact these guidelines have, especially given that the US spends $5.3 trillion on healthcare every year. So the aim of these is to make a big dent in their healthcare budget and really sort of change the health outcomes for Americans. And so I'll start by reading a quote from the first page. American households must prioritize diets built on whole, nutrient-dense food. And so obviously,
why did you pick that quote then?
Well, I mean, obviously, this is something I'm on board with because we've talked about that on the podcast countless times. And I think it is a big deal because this is a very big change. And the thing that everyone's talking about is that on the front cover, they've deliberately shown an inverted pyramid. And I think that's a very deliberate and bold repositioning of the guidelines to emphasize that they're not just a mild tweak, which previous versions have often been, almost indistinguishable from the version that came prior to it. So the widest part of the pyramid is now at the top, and it prominently features cheese, chicken, whole milk, broccoli, some other vegetables, salmon, olive oil, eggs, and meat. And then at the bottom, in the narrowest part of the pyramid, they have whole grains. And amusingly for us, they have a tiny sprinkling of oats.
I think, to be picky about this, I think the kind of diagram on the cover is being, like, as you say, kind of almost deliberately provocative, but if I've understood it correctly, in the content of it, it's not really a pyramid, right? The whole grains are presented as being a kind of third point of an equal triangle, rather than it being about the smallest part of what you eat.
Well, let's dive into that then. So originally, the US dietary guidelines recommended 6 to 11 servings of grains per day. And then more recently, that was reduced to 6 to 7 servings a day. And now it's 2 to 4 servings. So it is a significant reduction in the amount of carbohydrates. And there's also been a change where they are now entirely whole grains, where it used to be 50% refined grains. So the
guidance was literally that you should have 50% refined grains.
Yeah, as crazy as this sounds, I mean, up to 11 servings, half of which are refined grains.
Interesting.
So what else is interesting then is that the low carbohydrate diet is specifically mentioned in the context of tackling chronic diseases. So this is a quote. Individuals with certain chronic diseases may experience improved health outcomes when following a lower carbohydrate diet. And it mentions cardiovascular disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes in that context. So I think this is huge, since the vast majority of Americans have some kind of metabolic dysfunction. In fact, the recent studies show that only around 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. So it's just now easier to count the number of people that are healthy than unhealthy. And related to that, there's a lot of language about reducing added sugars, and it specifically states that no amount of added sugars are recommended for children ages 5 to 10 years. So there's some.
So this is really kind of like much tighter then, and being kind of like much more kind of direct about what it's saying are the causes of those types of disease.
Yep, exactly. And that ties in with a lot of what we've talked about on this podcast. And I think the evidence is in support of reducing carbohydrate.
I think the other thing that stuck out to me was it's got a lot in there about protein.
Yeah, so let's talk about protein. In our last episode, we talked about how the guidelines for protein were much too low. We were talking about it in the context of sort of athletic performance. But these new guidelines have recognized that, and they're recommending an intake of protein that's gone from 0.8 grams per kilo of body weight to a range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams, depending on demographics. So that's quite big in terms of a recognition that the protein guidance before was just too low.
Yeah, I mean, that's like what, potentially doubling,
doubling
the amount of protein that you're supposed to be eating.
Exactly.
Which linking it back to your introduction is not just necessarily just a recommendation that everyday people might follow, but actually affects what children are served in schools, or what all of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the US Armed Forces are fed, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Military personnel and so on. Yeah, it's a very big potential impact, let's say, at this stage.
Okay, so you've talked about carbohydrate, where they've said, broadly that most people would need to reduce the amount of carbohydrate, or certainly versus previous versions of the guidelines. They're talking about increasing the amount of protein very significantly. So maybe let's round this out by touching on the third macronutrient. What does it have to say about fat?
Yeah, good question. So every previous version of the guidelines has talked about polyunsaturated fats. So these are vegetable oils, and they have emphasized that these should be prioritized in the diet. And Americans were actually advised to consume 5.5 teaspoons of them per day. And obviously, we've made the case on the podcast back in episode 5 that these vegetable oils are to be avoided. So it's very good to see that the guidelines have dropped any mention of these. And in fact, the guidelines now state that healthy fats are plentiful in many whole foods, such as meat, poultry, eggs, omega-3 rich seafood, nuts, seeds, full-fat dairy, olives, and avocados. And
when it's saying healthy fats, what does that actually mean? It's not polyunsaturated fats.
Yeah, they're basically talking about fats that come from whole food sources, and they are emphasizing all of the right types of foods. So we've talked about the importance of the long chain omega-3 fatty acids before. We know that people have typically been eating way too many of the omega-6 fats that come from these polyunsaturated seed oils. So for me, this is a rebalancing of the advice. So they're saying, do go and eat these healthy fish and full-fat dairy and so on.
Gotcha.
It also says that when cooking or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils such as olive oil. But it also says that other options can include butter or beef tallow. Now, beef tallow is known as dripping in the UK, but I mean, I was shocked to see that in the guidelines. Shocked, but in a good way, because we've said before that these are healthy fats to cook with, and so it's good that they're mentioned.
And as a reminder, so this is because they are, these are saturated fats, or the butter and beef tallow are, and I think you've said that they're healthy to cook with because they're more stable at high temperatures.
Yeah, exactly. For the same reason we talk about things like lard and coconut oil and so on.
Right.
So yeah, this is a huge change. There's also no mention of cholesterol whatsoever. And so to my mind, this is the end of the low-fat diet. It's just a huge milestone in history. Now, we should say it's the end of the low-fat diet as far as this 10-page document is concerned. We don't know what the impact will be of this. The only strange and slightly contradictory thing in this is that they recommend a 10% cap on saturated fats, which is somewhat at odds with their recommendation to consume cheese, butter, and whole milk. And I figured out that if you limited your saturated fat to 10% of calories, as a man, you'd be limited to 1 tablespoon of butter, 40 grams of cheese, and somewhere between 1 and 3 cups of whole milk, which, I don't know who eats 40 grams of cheese, but it doesn't seem very much. So, they've covered themselves by saying more high-quality research is needed to determine which types of dietary fats best support long-term health. And I think that's quite odd, given that saturated fat is one of the most studied areas in nutrition science. And we have the highest quality evidence from randomized controlled trials. And we have studies covering hundreds of thousands of people. But anyway, aside from saturated fat, the guidelines are now much more in line with both science and common sense. And I would argue that if you're eating foods that humans have eaten for hundreds of thousands of years, then you don't need to worry about saturated fat. And so I think broadly this is a win for those in the nutrition community, and we'll just have to see if any other countries follow suit.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think let's not spend too long on this, but I think it'd be interesting to just touch on the sort of political angle to this, because so having published the guidelines, exactly as you say, it's then kind of to be seen what impact that actually has, both on Americans and on other countries' guidance. I think one thing that I think is worth mentioning or sort of acknowledging is that, at the head of the group who've developed this guidance is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's the Secretary for the US Department of Health and Human Services. And anyone who's been following the news will know that he has also put out various other pieces of advice that I think probably most people would feel are less well aligned with the science than this guidance. And so that may then lead people to be fairly mistrustful of this advice. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think there's a general mistrust now of large government bodies meddling in people's affairs anyway. So I think the chances of this being adopted in the way that the original guidelines were adopted back in the 70s are significantly less likely. Also, it takes months, if not years, for the ripple effect of this to be felt. For this then has to be rolled out into local legislation and enacted through schools and so on. So there's potential that this gets reversed before it even has the impact that it could have.
So I could see that.
So we'll see.
From a UK perspective as well, I think just puts us in an interesting position where we previously had very aligned guidance with the US guidance. We've now got the UK Eat Well guide says something really very significantly different to what the US guidelines say.
And we said that if you wanted to be healthy and live a long time, you shouldn't follow the Eat Well guide.
Yes, well, I know.
So it will be very interesting to see what happens. Our dietary guidelines committee gets together and has another look at the evidence. But I won't hold my breath.
Very good. Well, let's watch and wait.
We shall.
Okay, so maybe if we move on then from that little news bulletin, let's get into the kind of main topic of the podcast today, which I think is paleo or ancestral nutrition.
Yeah, I'm basically going to make the case that humans used to thrive, and to understand how we can thrive today, we need to understand where we went off the rails, basically. But before we dive in, I want to give some credit to some of the authors whose work has influenced my thinking on this subject. And top of the list would be Chris Kresser, who is still among the very best, and I highly recommend his books and podcasts. And I also want to acknowledge Rob Wolf and the work of Chris Masterjohn, who's an excellent PhD nutrition researcher. And a great resource for anybody that wants to explore this topic is the Weston A. Price Foundation website. And it's worth mentioning also that I've just finished a book called The Paleo Life by Claire Foges, which is a very good introduction to all of this, especially around why our lifestyle is making us unhappy.
Fantastic. So probably put some links to all that in the show notes.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. There are links in the show notes. So to understand this topic, we have to go back a couple of million years to Homo habilis, our earliest recognizable ancestor. So for 2.8 million years, which is around 90,000 generations, we lived as hunter-gatherers during a time referred to as the Paleolithic. And during this time, early humans formed small groups and developed basic stone tools that allowed them to fish, hunt, and gather plant foods. And this cooperative way of life allowed early humans to thrive. Not only were they strong, lean, and fit, but there's good evidence to suggest that diseases such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disease, and even some cancers were either rare or non-existent. And I'm going to cover some of that evidence. But before I do, there is something I need to address. Whenever I say that our Paleolithic ancestors thrived, people are quick to point out their short life expectancy, saying something like, didn't they all die in their 30s? And this is an important point to address. So the main issue here has to do with statistical averages, and the main factor skewing the life expectancy or the average life expectancy of our Paleolithic ancestors were the very high rates of mortality among young people. So for instance, infant mortality rates were around 30 times higher than they are in the US today, and early childhood mortality rates were more than 100 times higher than they are today. So basically, thanks to warfare and accidents and acute infectious diseases and just exposure to the elements and the harsh environment, infancy and early childhood were very dangerous, and so too was old age. But if you survive to around age 15, you could expect to have a pretty long life, with some studies putting the number in the low 70s or even higher than that. And crucially, they live to this kind of age without any signs of the chronic inflammatory and degenerative diseases that we consider to be normal.
Interesting. So overall, your argument is that Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan was wrong, and when he said that our lives were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, that's not exactly accurate.
It's definitely not accurate. And actually, in the book I was just talking about, The Paleo Life, I think Claire Foges does a very good job of debunking that. So the context for this then is that today, certainly in the developed world, we accept diseases such as heart disease, diabetes, and obesity as quote unquote normal. But while they're very common, in an evolutionary sense, they are definitely not normal. That's the argument that I'm making. And the evidence suggests that for the vast majority of our history, these diseases were either rare or non-existent. And we know that by looking at archaeological studies, which look at fossil remains and how they changed as we moved from being hunter-gatherers to essentially farmers and an agricultural diet and lifestyle. We can look at anthropological studies, which study populations of modern hunter-gatherers. And then there are randomized controlled trials, which compare an ancestral diet with other popular diets like the Mediterranean diet. And then there are biochemical studies which look at the nutrient density of particular foods. But we've already talked quite a lot about those on the podcast, so I won't dive into that again today. But let's briefly cover some of these others. So archaeological records show that following this shift to an agricultural diet, our hunter-gatherers' ancestors actually shrank. And this was due to a decline in the nutrient density of our staple foods. And intergenerationally, height is a good indicator of health status. Other things we see from the fossil record is that iron deficiency anemia became commonplace, and so did other vitamin deficiency diseases such as beriberi, pellagra, rickets, and scurvy, which haven't completely disappeared as we've talked about before. There were also a lot more occurrences of tooth enamel defects that were further evidence of malnutrition. And during this period, life expectancy or average life expectancy actually fell.
Is there an argument that, I mean, I guess this is maybe factored for in the studies, but so you talked about kind of pre-farming, the like high rate of infant mortality and basically people being killed by environmental factors. Is there a chance that that's what is skewing the data, so that effectively you've got the weakest people within the population being killed by environmental factors at a much younger age than post introduction of farming, and that's why you've then got only the sort of very strongest examples who are living to an older age, and then also obviously their bones are looking better?
I'm not sure. There's a famous site in Turkey that shows that as we made this shift over several thousand years from hunter-gatherers to essentially Neolithic farmers, men shrank by about 6 inches and women by about 5 inches. So
that's massive, isn't it?
Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's been attributed to the fact that we've gone from eating, organ meat to eating wheat and barley and oats and so on.
But presumably did allow for an increase in total population.
Oh, absolutely. And all the cultural advantages that came with that. Yeah. So then we can look at anthropological studies, and these combined with medical reports from communities that still follow their traditional diet and lifestyle show that these contemporary hunter-gatherers have far fewer modern diseases. So if we look at a couple of examples, a study of the Catawbans who live in the Trobriand Islands, which is part of Papua New Guinea, found that none of the 2,300 men or women that were studied had ever experienced heart disease or stroke, which is quite remarkable when you consider that most of them smoke. And smoking is one of the main risk factors for heart disease,
right?
Which is the topic for a future episode. And the Catawbans also had very low levels of leptin and insulin, which are associated with leanness and overall metabolic health. And it was noted that they were very lean, with an average BMI of 20 in men and 18 in women. And for comparison, in 2016, the average BMI of Americans was 29, which is overweight and only just below the obese category. And the Catawbans eat exclusively root vegetables, fruits, fish, and coconuts.
I remember you mentioning them actually in a previous episode as an example of a traditional diet that is actually quite high in carbohydrate.
Exactly. And so there are lots of these different hunter-gatherer communities we could talk about, and there are more than 20. But in contrast to the Catawbans, let's just talk about the Inuit. So their diet obviously being very high in fat and very low in fruits and vegetables, primarily consisting of fish, seals, whale, caribou, walrus, birds, and eggs. Although there's some evidence that they would trade and travel quite long distances to get hold of lichen and some plant produce. And obviously they're in an environment which is marginal at best for human habitation. And yet early explorers, physicians, and other scientists who've studied them unanimously report that the Inuit enjoy excellent health and vitality. And a study by Dr. John Simpson in the mid-1850s showed that they were robust, muscular, and active, and had a markedly healthy appearance. And he noted that the physical constitution of both men and women was strong, and that they had magnificent dental development and basically no signs of tooth decay. So those are just two examples. And
it's a hell of a compliment, I think, to be told that you've got magnificent dental development.
Absolutely. So one of the things, if you read about the work of Dr. Weston A. Price, who was actually a dentist, and he spent a decade or so traveling around the world living with all these remote tribes, he would study their teeth. And when he returned to America, he was just shocked at the kind of narrow facial bone structure and crowding of teeth. And he attributed a lot of that to poor nutritional status. So, yeah, I don't know, it just becomes something you start looking out for when you know these things. But the important point here is that certainly in terms of macronutrient composition, these Paleolithic diets varied enormously. So you had some that were very high in fat, like the Inuit who we just talked about, 85% of their calories from fat. We know that the Maasai get 60 or 70% of their calories from fat. And then you have others that are very high in carbs, like the Catawbans we just talked about. And the Okinawans as well get 60 to 70% of their calories from carbohydrate. And this huge variation was due to a lot of environmental factors like climate, latitude, topography, and soil composition. But these diets did have a few important things in common. So one thing we know is that they contained very high levels of vitamins and minerals, especially the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, which are important for immune health and skeletal development. They contained a mix of both plant and animal foods, and so none of them were entirely carnivorous nor entirely vegan. They ate the whole animal, and it seems they placed a lower priority on muscle meat, instead concentrating on organ meat. A key factor was that food was not available all the time, so periods of fasting were basically mandatory, and they proved to be extremely beneficial. So that's worth noting. They provided extra nutrition to those trying to conceive, pregnant women, breastfeeding women, and growing children. So that's interesting. And they contained prebiotic fiber and resistant starch that fed and nurtured our gut microbiome.
Talk a bit more about that. What sorts of foods have that prebiotic fiber?
Damn, I knew you were going to ask that. I think it's to do with the way that they used to cure foods because they didn't have refrigeration and stuff. I don't know enough about that to answer it very well. But let's brush up on it because obviously there's a gap in my knowledge.
I think the only thing missing from this list is the feasting, where we know that they were fasting, but I imagine anyway that they were doing plenty of feasting as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's good evidence for that. We've seen studies where anthropologists will follow remote tribes, and when they discover some sort of bounty, it might be like a bee's nest full of honey, they will literally just drink liters of the stuff because they don't know when it's going to appear again. It may only appear once a year. And so, yeah, they will gorge themselves on honey or ripe fruits and other things for sure.
Excellent.
It's also worth mentioning some of the randomized controlled trials that have compared an ancestral paleo type diet with other popular diets. And there was a 2015 meta-analysis that pooled results from 4 of the best trials, and it found statistically significant improvements in all 5 components of metabolic syndrome, with the paleo diet outperforming diets like the Mediterranean diet on short-term metabolic markers, particularly glucose tolerance, triglycerides, and blood pressure. A 2017 study also assessed metabolic health via 2 key biomarkers, HbA1c and something called HOMA-IR. And it found that those on a paleo diet, their HbA1c decreased by 0.9% and their HOMA-IR improved by 45%, which is an effect size comparable to that reported for the diabetes drug metformin. So there have been quite a few studies where people have adopted a low carbohydrate paleo type diet and they've been able to come off diabetes medications because blood glucose control is done through diet. So I'm making the case that thanks to the diversity and nutrient density of the foods they ate, our hunter-gatherer ancestors enjoyed robust health for hundreds of thousands of years, and that our biology and our genes evolved, meaning that they were selected for, in a very specific environment. And starting about 11,000 years ago, that environment began to change, and it did so much more quickly than we could adapt. And this was the agricultural revolution, when we transitioned away from our hunter-gatherer roots to a life that was essentially centered around farming, and that represents less than 0.4% of our genetic lineage. So what happened was that rather than moving around, we stayed in one place. We started planting crops and domesticating cattle, as well as sheep and goats and pigs. And we started eating cereal grains, which became a bigger and bigger part of our diet. And I've talked about this before, how survival foods became staples. So they were there originally because if we didn't manage to come back from the hunt with anything, we didn't go hungry. But over time, they just became, part of our staple diet. And then our way of life was altered even more dramatically by the Industrial Revolution. So we've seen a reduction in the nutrient content of our soil due to industrial monocrop agriculture, a reduction in the variety of food we eat. We used to have hundreds of different species of plants, but now 80% of the world's population subsist on just 4 plant foods: rice, corn, wheat, and soybeans. And our lifestyles,
and
obviously,
I mean, presumably, kind of on top of that, there would have been many different subspecies of, types of rice, types of corn, types of wheat, many of which have now not been grown or, have tended to move towards the 1 or 2 varieties that are the most productive.
Absolutely. Yeah, they would have been selectively bred and hybridized for various properties, for sure. And so as part of this, obviously our lifestyles became more sedentary. We began experiencing chronic stress. We get less exposure to sunlight because we're working indoors rather than outside. And the list goes on and on. But the central argument is that in evolutionary terms, all of this has happened in the blink of an eye. So we had 90,000 generations as hunter-gatherers, just 366 generations as Neolithic farmers, and now about 6 generations as whatever you call us now, modern SIG people. I don't know what we call us now. And yeah, it's hasn't been nearly long enough for us to have made the complex genetic adaptations that would allow us to thrive in this environment. And obviously we have made some genetic adaptations. Only around 10% of our genes show signs of recent selection. But those adaptations that we have made, such as the evolution of light skin in response to less sunlight and the ability to digest lactose into adulthood, are simple genetic adaptations involving a single gene, usually just turning it on or off. But to allow us to thrive in this environment, so for example, to fully break down and assimilate cereal grains, we would require the coordinated adaptation of many genes. And that's why some of these foods, like cereal grains, are so problematic for a lot of people. It's just we haven't adapted to eat them. So, in evolutionary terms, we've quite suddenly found ourselves in an environment to which we're not at all suited. And the result is the modern epidemic of chronic disease. And an example, just looking at mental health disorders, our brains just haven't evolved to cope with the habitats that we live in. And depression is the leading cause of disability, affecting more than 120 million people worldwide. And what's striking about this is that those that live in urban areas are much more likely to suffer from depression, around 20% more likely than those living in rural locations. And the same applies for other conditions as well. So people living in urban environments are 21% more likely to suffer from generalized anxiety, twice as likely to suffer from schizophrenia, and 77% more likely to develop psychosis. So all of this lends weight to the evolutionary mismatch that we find ourselves in today. And so that's really it in a nutshell. That's why I go on about it as being very important.
It's quite a compelling story, isn't it? I think it's just for the sake of playing skeptic, I'll say that obviously correlation and sequence are not causation. So just because these two things happened, we developed the industrialized food system and then we got unhealthy, doesn't necessarily prove that that was the cause. But I think the inclusion of the sort of short-term biomarkers that you can see in randomized control trials and things does start to build a pretty compelling picture.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything that completely refutes this hypothesis, and I think the evolutionary mismatch explains a lot. There is one thing we should mention, though, that when I was looking at the trial data, it did raise an important safety concern with paleo-type diets, which is that because typically you take away table salt and dairy, there's a higher risk of iodine deficiency, and that's relevant for thyroid function, particularly in women of reproductive age. So again, regardless of your dietary pattern, it makes sense to do some tracking periodically and then look for gaps in your diet. So I don't think the advice changes just because you're eating a nutrient-dense whole foods diet. You should still be on the lookout for what you're missing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I guess also we've talked about the way that different people's bodies have the ability to process nutrients at different rates and things. So, just because you happen to be, eating what seems to be enough for the average person doesn't necessarily mean that your nutrient status is good.
Absolutely. So, yeah, we're going to talk about tracking as a specific topic in a future episode. And I think we're going to do a day in the life of. So, what should you track throughout your day, starting with HRV when you wake up, and all those sorts of things. I think it'd be quite an interesting topic.
Yeah, that'd be really good. Didn't we also have a listener question that relates to this topic? Maybe we could cover that just before we close.
Yes, I think we did. I think we had Paul from Hampshire.
Okay, let me pull that out of the mailbag. So Paul from Hampshire says, is the human body designed to give the maximum health and longevity if, in conjunction with good exercise, it is 100% fueled 100% of the time, i.e. all nutrient, vitamins and minerals targets are met daily? Surely that wasn't sustainable over the period of human evolution. And I guess, put it another way, so does the body benefit from prolonged periods of hardship? Should people be intentionally taking breaks from optimal nutrition? And if so, then for how long?
No, yes. I counted 4 questions in there. No, it's a really good thing for us to cover. So we talked about it in the episode today, that food wasn't available 24/7, and very beneficial things happen in the body when you go without food. So you upregulate cellular repair because your body isn't focused on the task of digestion, which is metabolically very expensive takes a lot of energy to do digestion. So when you're not doing it, your body can do other things. It can go and clean up senescent cells, which is great for cancer prevention. And all sorts of useful things happen when you go for periods without food. So the way to think about this, I think, is a progression from you could start with a feeding window and do time restricted feeding and just basically eat within an 8-hour window and try and fast for the rest of the time. Try and do that. You can do that every day of the week. That's still safe. I do want to correct something though. I don't think you want to have a break from optimum nutrition, to use Paul's wording. You absolutely want to meet your nutrient needs, but you want to do them within that 8-hour feeding window. And then the other thing you can do, you can play around with sort of a monthly 24-hour fast. And once you become quite sort of fat adapted, to use sort of a slang expression, and we talked about metabolic flexibility in the last episode, you'll find it easier to leave big gaps, and then doing a 24-hour fast won't be that much of a big deal, or at least it shouldn't be. But it might feel quite difficult if you're stressed. So I wouldn't recommend fasting if you're under a lot of stress, emotional, physical duress. I don't think they're very compatible. So maybe on a Sunday, just don't eat. See how you get on, and then Ed's laughing. How else do you do fasting, Ed? Just don't eat.
Just don't do it for hours on end.
It's funny. You'd be amazed how much extra time you've got. But you do become very focused on when your next meal is, when you're going to break your fast. You start really fantasizing about that, and it's quite funny. And then when you get round to it, I've often found that it's almost an anticlimax. You go, well, I could do without. I could carry on, and I think there is a threshold. Well, where you've done a day, you could probably do 2 or 3 days. But I've only ever done that when I'm ill, so I can't really comment on that. What about you, Ed?
What, longest fast? Yeah, I've probably not even done a day, to be honest. I would say probably
half an hour.
Yeah, exactly. Probably 18 hours or something like that.
Yeah. It can be very convenient to build that flexibility, especially if you're traveling and the food options are really poor. So yeah, I recommend it. So, any closing thoughts from you, Ed, on what I've said? Any more?
Well, I think these were 2 very interesting topics to discuss together, because, I mean, although the USDA food guidelines are not explicitly paleo, you can definitely see some kind of common themes. There's a focus on reducing ultra-processed foods that wouldn't have been available to our Paleolithic ancestors, and on reducing refined carbohydrates, plus, I guess, a focus on increasing nutrient-dense whole foods. So there's definitely agreement on the direction of travel there.
Yeah, that's right. So shall we conclude our episode by answering the not so fun question from the start?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so the big reveal then. So I asked the question, what is considered the leading risk factor for death globally, accounting for around 11 million premature deaths each year? And the answer is poor diet. And it does actually surpass tobacco and smoking. So yeah, these deaths are primarily linked to diseases like heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, rather than sort of outright malnutrition or anything like that. But it's something we're going to talk about in
poor
the
diet
next
does
episode.
Okay, but so poor diet does presumably include both eating too much or too much of the wrong thing, as well as not having any access to food and having
absolutely overfed but undernourished, for sure.
There's both.
And absolutely, and the metabolic and inflammatory consequences of the typical Western diet. Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Well, should we just do a little bit on what we've got coming up in future episodes?
Yeah, we're going to talk about an interesting case study that I worked on a few years ago, where a 50-year-old man wanted my help to manage and improve his autoimmune conditions. And there were significant diet and lifestyle factors that were contributing to his symptoms, chief among which was long-term oxidative stress. So I'm going to talk about what oxidative stress is, what was contributing to it in this case, what my advice was, and we'll talk more broadly about how long-term oxidative stress contributes to the development of not just autoimmune diseases, but cancer, heart disease, and many other diseases. So I think that will be an interesting one. And
that sounds really good.
I also want to talk about cardiovascular disease. So we've got lots to look forward to, and I know that there's more in the mailbag. So
yeah, definitely. I think we've got a few to catch up on, actually.
Okay, brilliant. Well, let's leave it there and try and come back soon.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. See you soon, Ben.
Bye, everyone.
Hey there, everybody, gather round. Ben and Ed are here, spreading knowledge around. Porridge in the morning, is that how you should start? The search for nutrients, breakfast is a tasty work of art. What about porridge? It's a big deal. Join us every week. We've got that wholesome appeal. What about porridge?
Rice coin. Right, I can't speak. Coin. Oh, come on.